Thank you, Chloe, for the introductions, and thank you also to David for setting us up so nicely for our discussion this afternoon on natural climate solutions. Now, before we begin the discussion, I see we have a lot of responses coming in already for our first poll question here. So it looks like more than 2/3 of you think that agriculture is the most prevalent driver of deforestation, and about the remaining spread across urban expansion, mining, and infrastructure. Looks like we have a very informed audience within our mix today, and let us see if you are right. Indeed, if we look at large-scale commercial agriculture, it actually contributes to 40% of deforestation, followed closely by a third from local subsistence farming. Now, really what this is telling us is that there are various competing uses for land, and in some instances, the trade-offs or the choices we have to make become even more stark when we take into considerations other objectives around food security, around socio-economic implications. Now, obviously, this makes it even more challenging for us to then scale forest conservation and restoration activities. So I would like to turn to Radha, because you have been with New Forest since 2006, and is a leading asset manager for sustainable forestry. Now, fast forward 17 years on, we are still seeing a shortage of supply for high-quality forestry conservation restoration projects. Where do you think are the sources of friction that still exist even up to today?
Yeah, well, thanks, Lingmin, and it's been a wonderful week being here, so thank you for inviting me back. So just to step back, right, we need a clean energy transition and we need a sustainable land use transition, clearly from the data that you just showed. And there's three key activities that we need in this category of nature-based climate solutions. We have to protect intact forests. We have to improve timberlands and working agricultural lands. And we have to restore, to the degree of hundreds of millions of hectares of forests around the world. And even though, we have the technology of photosynthesis in hand, I'd argue that, land use transition is going to be probably the hardest part of the climate transition, because precisely we're dealing with the land use decisions of hundreds of millions of small farmers around the world. We have complex global agribusiness supply chains. And frankly, we have land use competition amongst food, fiber for biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels, fiber for timber products, and the ecosystem services that we need. And one of the points I wanted to make, and I think I was having a conversation with some people about this earlier this week, is that carbon pricing doesn't simply just solve your problems. In fact, it can actually create more problems when we think about land use. So I live in Australia, and a few years ago, across the Tasman Sea in New Zealand, the price of carbon went up over $50. And what we saw was that dairy farms were just getting bought out, and people were planting permanent pine trees or pine plantations, which really upset the farmers. It upset the mills because people weren't might sell less timber into the mills. And it really demonstrated that we have to be thinking very holistically about nature-based solutions and the use of the land that we are working with, and how our farmers and land managers going to use land. So I think for the carbon markets to be successful in scaling nature-based solutions, we have to be thinking about integrated land use and not just displacing land use, which means we have to be much more thoughtful and proactive, particularly from a government policy perspective, but also as companies are thinking about investing in nature-based solutions, around more planning and efficient use of land, and government policy thinking about how do we want to allocate land for all the different uses that we need, and that we are incorporating, social values and cultural values of First Nations farmers and the different communities. I mean, certainly from a New Forest perspective, this is what we've been trying to do with our investment strategy. So, GenZero has an investment with us in our Asia strategy, where we're integrating sustainable FSC certified timber plantations alongside carbon projects and forest conservation. In Australia, we're working on putting on, tree plantations onto agricultural land, and also working with outgrower schemes and smallholders. So we really take this kind of integrated land use approach, and not just think about, just carbon pricing, but really how do we think about a more integrated approach to nature-based solutions?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a great point touching on in terms of integrated land use. And I know even at for Marie at Wavemaker, you're also working with smallholder farmers. Rather talked about agriculture. Over there, you're trying to get smallholder farmers to adopt regenerative practices. And in these instances, they're often the most rural, most fragmented demographics. So clearly, you must be seeing a lot of challenges. Can you talk to us about some of them?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, GenZero, and well done, Temasek, for this incredible week. So, you know, I'm Singaporean. I'm kind of a city girl. The closest I came to agriculture is like farming on my balcony, right? But the more time that I spend in this space, what I've started to realize is that ag tech's this unique opportunity, which sits at the intersection of being able to positively impact food security, impact the livelihoods of the hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers that Radha mentioned that you know, underpin our food system, and then also, you know, very positively help to fight climate change. So, you know, 50% of emissions in Southeast Asia come from a combination of land use change and agriculture, but also it's an incredibly, you know, inefficient and fragmented space. So, you know, I'll give you the example from rice cultivation, which is the venture that GenZero, Wavemaker Impact, Temasek, and Breakthrough Energy Ventures have co-invested in. And across Southeast Asia, the average yield of rice farms is about 3 to 4 tons per hectare. Now you compare that to 7 tons in China, or in Australia and the US, you know, you can get up to 12 tons a hectare. You realize that, you know, there's huge yield gaps. There's also inefficiency when it comes to input supply chains, inefficiency when it comes to offtake. And as a result, that means that there's a lot of opportunity to take advantage of these economic opportunities in order to, you know, be able to create business models and solutions that really work. So in terms of the challenges, I think there are 2. So the first is that working with smallholder farmers requires a high-touch approach. And that means that, you know, things like technical assistance and being able to provide that community-level support to farmers is essential in order to make solutions actually work and drive adoption. And that technical assistance can't solely be on the basis of grants or NGO programs. It has to be actually baked into and integrated into the unit economics of business models. The second key challenge that we see is that, you know, you have to create the right incentives for farmers to actually change their behavior. You know, I think it's unfair that smallholder farmers have to pay the cost of investment and essentially self-fund the transition. So it's critical that when we work with smallholder farmers, particularly towards climate outcomes, that we really do it on a basis of building trust, which means that farmers have to see real benefits within the first season that we start to work with them. And then that enables us to then, you know, work out ways which we can serve them and grow our impact across the entirety of the activities of this particular stakeholder set.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. I think we've heard a lot around sort of integrated land management and also how we work in the agricultural space. And of course, we also heard about sort of carbon being more of an enabler and shouldn't be a means, it's a means to an end, but shouldn't be an end in itself, sort of carbon markets being a financing tool. And so to Giulia, you've been with various, you know, NGOs looking, really advancing the sustainable development, environmental issues, topics related to that. And we talked a lot about climate and carbon. But really, as we look at the natural landscapes and within nature-based solutions projects, what are truly some of the other outcomes we should be considering as well?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Actually, this is the reason why I joined this project a year and a half ago, because I realized that natural climate solutions are, especially through the voluntary carbon market, is a powerful way to finance nature conservation and development. Climate is the vector to get in, but effectively, as actually David just mentioned, these are powerful development and conservation projects. So what is important, however, is also to educate the buyers in not only looking at what are the climate mitigation outcomes, but also about identifying good projects from a biodiversity conservation and socioeconomic perspective, which are complex issues. And that's also why maybe some of the standards, the definition of what is a good outcome from a biodiversity and socioeconomic perspective are not so advanced as for the climate mitigation, because every project will be different and there isn't the metric for biodiversity or for socioeconomic, but we can still do it. And it's one of the, let's say, challenges that the organization I work for, the Natural Climate Solution Alliance, has really picked up to try to really get more clarity, the tools to be able to understand the difference between projects. Now, there is also true that there are a lot of excellent players along the value chain of an NCS project. So from the project development all the way to in the hand of a end user, so the companies that buys and retires the credit. There are a lot of excellent players there that can really help companies to understand what's behind that credit. And there are some amazing stories behind that credit, right? There is the efforts of the project developers, there is the efforts of the communities, and there are, a lot of market intermediaries that can help, uncover that. So as I said, it's important. One of the things I always say, let's not talk about biodiversity and social co-benefits, because these are not co-benefits, these are core benefits. These are the pillars of a very successful project. You can't imagine having a successful project that looks at climate mitigation that does not involve the community and does not involve biodiversity gains. Well, it might have an immediate good outcome, but in the long term, you can secure the long-term outcome only if you have a real good, conservation strategy and a socioeconomic strategy involving communities. So that's why, we see them as a natural trio, in a way, going, forward. But it's true that it's a little bit scary because, it's easier to measure carbon, easy. I'm looking at David, not that easy to measure carbon, but to measure other aspects becomes even more complicated. But I don't think we should, shy away. This is an opportunity for really the transition and involving everybody in the transition. As Maria was saying, we want also the farmers part of the transition. We need the community as part of the transition. And the carbon financing is the way to get them, to be part of it, and not to do it as a charity, but really as, stewards of the land. So that's basically, I think, our message is the biodiversity and social elements must be part of the solution, and therefore when going out and trying to purchasing a carbon credit, a company should also ask these questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the other dimension that Giulia was really adding into our conversation besides climate and carbon is really the biodiversity and social elements, which all individually are highly complex topics. And so just given the backdrop of this, how do you think that on the buyer side, on corporates and investors, as they start looking at different project types and the different parameters that they actually need to discern, how are you thinking about supporting them in terms of mainstreaming of decision-making around these project types?
So, well, that's exactly the core of what we are trying to do at the NCS Alliance, to mainstream. And there are different strategies where we are using, and I think also my world is quite different, when I started it over 2 years ago, and now in terms of the type of obstacles and pushback. But certainly we need, well, first of all, some rules also of the game for the demand side. There has been a lot of discussions about what are the rules of the game, for example, from the supply side, really important, ICVCM, the Integrity Council coming up with this benchmark standard. But it's also very important to have clear rules of the game from the buyer's perspective. So when is acceptable from a societal perspective to use carbon credits? Now, parentheses, natural climate solutions are not only carbon credits, right? The voluntary carbon market is one way to finance natural climate solutions, but there are a lot of other ways. I mean, Maria was talking about agriculture. In the agricultural space, the in-value chain interventions are going to play the key role, and you don't necessarily have to go and buy credits on a market. But the market offers a great opportunity for companies that are already in their transition to net zero to do more. And one of the things we are trying to do is to make the business case for companies to do more, because even for companies that reach their corporate level, net zero is not going to be sufficient. We know that now. We all need to do more. And so the voluntary carbon market, used in a proper way, and these are the rules that, for example, VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, is coming up with, will help businesses that are on that journey to do more. So one thing we are working on is creating trust. So going to companies that are already purchasing carbon credits, doing it, that they're doing it in the right way in the transition to net zero, trying to promote them, to create trust in the other companies, that those that I call them sitting on the fence, kind of afraid of this space, not really knowing if it's worth going and doing this extra effort. We want to push them to play in our, in the game. And the second one is knowledge, and knowledge for everybody, peer-to-peer experience, knowledge sharing. We are going to launch an NCS procurement hub in a couple of months, which is going to be a space for businesses to actually have discussion peer-to-peer, only for businesses to learn and exchange information, get to also understand how to maybe work together between companies on specifically the voluntary carbon market for NCS. This is a space that we feel like is going to be very complementary to a lot of other initiatives that are out there, such as we said, ICVCM, VCMI, but others such as, BASC and other coalitions such as LEAF, but they're all very complementary. We are probably going to be right now covering the space of knowledge sharing and the opportunity, as I said, for businesses to have that conversation about, what are the things that are working, what are the things that are not working, that will help companies kind of, move forward.
Great, great. Thanks, Giulia. I actually want to pick up on one of the reference you made also to Marie around some of the alternative, innovative business models is wrapped around really trying to incentivize certain behavior beyond just leveraging carbon financing as a tool. So I think, Marie, you have thoughts to share around some of those?
Yeah, so at Wavemaker Impact, what we do is we build what we call 100 by 100 companies. So these are companies with the ability to abate 100 megatons of carbon emissions equivalent and be $100 million businesses at scale. And so we're always looking for that intersection between creating real carbon impact and also creating genuine commercial value, right? And it's all about unlocking these value pockets that enable us to create these sustainable business models. And in the agricultural context, what we know, particularly in Southeast Asia, is that farmers are being squeezed. They're being squeezed out of agriculture as a reliable and sustainable source of income. Because of declining soil health, yields are going down, and at the same time, costs are going up. So for example, last year, fertilizer cost in Vietnam was at a 50-year high. It's a crisis which is coming in the short term. In the next kind of 4 to 5 years, farming is no longer going to be sustainable here. So there's a couple of things we know when we try to create these business models. And the first thing is that carbon credits alone are unlikely to be enough. So, the average rice farmer, for example, in Southeast Asia cultivates less than half a hectare. On average, we know from a few Vera projects that it's about 4 to 5 tons per hectare that you can expect. So if we throw, say, $10 a ton as a price and half a hectare, that's $25 a year that's going to be going to a farmer. So that's not going to be enough to enable them to make that kind of transition. And then the second thing that we know, which is sort of what Giulia mentions, is the transition is difficult to finance. So we're building a venture right now focused on creating incentives for farmers to adopt agroforestry and regenerative ag practices in commodity farming in Vietnam. And we estimate that it takes about $5,000 per hectare to incentivize a farmer to introduce practices like intercropping. And this is going to pay back over time. It's going to create a new sustainable revenue stream for the farmer, but you only see that benefit in year 7. We're talking about a farmer who makes about 1.5K, so $1,500 per hectare, and you're expecting them to take on a loan of $5,000 and take 3 years to cultivate a second crop. It sort of doesn't make sense from a farmer's perspective. So we have to look at different mechanisms in order to create interesting business models and look for inefficiencies and value pockets. For example, in rice, we're focusing on input financing and the changes around that. better relationships with off-takers. And that's where I would say also, partners like Giulia are very important in helping to raise awareness from the private sector in the role that they also have to play in order to create the right economic incentives and long-term off-take contracts, for example, that will create the right environment for farmers to be able to do this in a economically sustainable way.
Great, great. I'm going to take this time to also segue to some of the live Q&A that we're seeing, because some of them are actually quite related to the topics that we're discussing right now. Talked a lot around agricultural projects, especially those with sort of the ability to remove carbon from the environment. One of the questions that we have here is relating to agri projects that have commercial outcomes with carbon removal still face some challenges in demonstrating financial additionality in the absence of a common definition of the term. We have any ideas to address this? Don't know if maybe Radha or Giulia have some initial thoughts around this one.
Well, I think one of the things that is important to recognize in different parts of the world, and I know we're sitting here talking about voluntary carbon markets, but I think it's important to think maybe a bit more broadly about carbon finance and land use. I mean, certainly in different parts of the world, when we look at regulated markets, whether it's the California carbon market or in Australia or New Zealand, all the different places have defined additionality, financial additionality, set baselines in different ways, because they're trying to take into account the unique political aspects, economic, industry, social challenges in those countries to set baselines and consider what is additional. I'm not going to get into all the technical detail of that. So similarly, in the voluntary market, I think there are some well-established rules to look at, whether a commercial forestry project is additional. So certainly in parts of Southeast Asia, you don't have large amounts of institutional long-term capital going into sustainable forestry. We don't have a lot of money going into certainly ecosystem restoration. So I don't know that I totally agree that additionality is a huge issue, because we simply don't see a huge amount of money going into sort of sustainable nature-based solutions in certainly in some of the emerging markets that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can also offer a point of view on this one, I think when it comes to additionality, I think in some instances when we see even in specific cities or provinces within certain countries, where even when we see sort of top-down financial incentives that's been put in place, the actual adoption by the smallholder farmers is still far beneath what the intended policy direction should be achieving. And so I think even from this perspective, we can probably still prove that a project is financially additional, can demonstrate financial additionality, notwithstanding kind of having already existing kind of regulatory policies in place.
Yeah, but maybe getting back to David's original point too, and it's very hard without knowing a specific example from the person who's submitted this question, but getting back to David's kind of earlier point, we're talking about broad-scale transitions, right? Regenerative agriculture, moving from unproductive smallholder agriculture to more productive, thinking about larger scale forest conservation, broad scale ecosystem restoration. So you almost have to flip the question on its head and say, well, where could we get the most bang for buck in these big transitions that we need, and can we get bigger pools of capital going to finance these transitions from a carbon finance perspective, or other kind of outcomes, biodiversity and nature outcomes as well that we want to see in those landscapes.
Yeah, so just another point about additionality, which I think is a very important core principle for any for all the standards that are operating in the voluntary carbon market, and ICVCM is going to define some kind of common rules about additionality, which means basically that project, that intervention would have not happened without the financing of the voluntary carbon market. And personally, I think it's a really important process because we don't want to, through the voluntary carbon market, just shift resources around. It has to be additional, right? These are resources that would have not materialized unless you had the voluntary carbon market. There are going to be different ways of measuring additionalities, not just financial additionality. There are going to be other tests. But I think there is another element for agri-projects, especially when we're talking about removal, therefore soil carbon, that are making them very complex. It is not just the additionalities, how you're actually going to quantify the outcome. That is complex, and not all, for some type of methodology is easier for certain type of interventions. For others, such as I think soil carbon, is more complex. So I think that's another element. In this case, is about additionality, but I would say also quantifying the mitigation outcome in terms of carbon is also going to make them complex. But as we said, not all agri-interventions are for the voluntary carbon market. There are a lot of opportunities within the value chain, which is actually, we say, if you're a business, the first place to look for NCS is within your own value chain before you go out and start buying something else.
Exactly. And I think just on this topic around removals, maybe it's also a nice link to the next question that I'm seeing coming from the audience as well, around the comparison between removals and avoidance. And we get that a lot, very frequently, especially within the nature-based solution space. So should there really be a pecking order across the different NBS project types? Avoidance being more of the conservation types project, the RED Plus, versus the removals, which is more reforestation, afforestation, soil carbon sequestration.
From a conservation perspective, yes, there is it is an important order because in terms of conservation, and especially if you're looking at biodiversity, it's much more effective to conserve an area than restore it. And then even from a carbon perspective, it's much more effective to keep your pool rather than rebuilding it. It takes much longer and it's much more expensive. So that's why we say from an NCS hierarchy and a conservation hierarchy, but every time you talk about conservation hierarchy in the voluntary carbon market and beyond, is always first is avoid, always avoid. And the last one is restore, because it's so much more effective, especially when you're talking about places, biodiversity values that cannot be replaced. I do understand, however, from the question about additionality and measurement and baseline is much more complex to define if the real added value of a project that has had avoidance compared to removal. So these are, I think there are two separate points, and they should not be brought together. From a strategic conservation perspective, it's most effective to avoid, to avoid first, so to protect your pool. But then between avoidance and removal, you have improved management, which very rarely people talk about, which include also some part of reduction, some parts of removals, because you have the soil carbon, which is a removal, but you have a lot of practices in agriculture that actually are about avoidance of emissions. So there is a sequence, and it is important somehow to look at that with this kind of understanding that also, if you are able to demonstrate additionality, then avoidance should really come first.
That's interesting. So from a science or from a conservation objectives perspective, to you see sort of the pecking order being conservation, improved management, and then removals. But at the same time, we're also seeing kind of different from a buyer or market adoption perspective in terms of the big coming through higher carbon pricing for removals versus for avoidance. Radha, do you sort of agree with the same pecking order that Giulia was talking about?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I'm saying the same thing as Giulia, so I'm not going to dwell on this point, but we need all three solutions. We need to protect intact forests, we have to improve working lands, and we have to restore. All three of those things need to happen, and so somehow this kind of this idea that removals are better than avoidance has somehow kind of come into the lexicon. I personally don't agree with that, because we have to protect what we already have. And so my hope is that as these frameworks move forward and we think about how we're going to move forward on carbon finance, we work on all three solutions at the same time and recognize that we need to do all three of those things together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Marie, kind of thoughts?
I mean, exactly the same. And I think the best analogy that I've heard on this is that, you know, where we are at the moment is kind of like a leaking boat with a hole in it, right? So that's filling up with water, right? So in order to get ourselves out of this situation, first we have to stop the leak, which is what avoidance is about. And then we've kind of got to bail. And bailing is what removals is about. And I suppose what I love about agriculture is that, you know, there is the opportunity through better regenerative agricultural practices and soil sequestration to do both of that at the same time.
Absolutely.
Just one, not to dwell on this, but I guess maybe because I'm sitting here with people I've known for 25 years, you know, somehow tropical forest conservation has kept falling out or been this kind of continuous problem child where all of us got into the environmental field because we want to protect forests. So let's figure out how to do that effectively.
Exactly.
That's our job.
Exactly, exactly. And so in figuring out how to do this, the next question is around sort of the modality. How do we actually get this done? Are nature-based solutions then more appropriately funded by grants, concessionary capital, or investors, I guess, like GenZero, with a need to deliver attractive commercial returns in addition to the climate impact?
Well, I'm not you know, I don't own land, or I'm not part of a project. But what really struck me from the beginning of my journey as part of the NCS Alliance was the testimonials of some of the projects that we have collected and the communities that were, you know, put together these testimonials about how much more proud they are by receiving funds through an economic activity than going after grants. Now, there is the pride, the sense of pride of being really steward and having basically, it's a business model, and it's not just, you know, a grant. And we are not saying, you know, that grants are absolutely fantastic. They're often the starting phase for a project, but in the long term, I think, well, the feedback we received from, you know, all the projects that we have analyzed, and there are around 20, is really about you know, it creates a different dynamic. And there is also that stability, that possibility of having a long-term perspective. I mean, David, we come back. David, you really made a great opening there, because, you know, we know how it works with grant. I mean, my work actually is financed with grant, and I tell you, every 12 months I have to go and start thinking again. So by the time you finish one, you have to start another one, and you don't have that long-term perspective of saying, okay, this is a business. I have a job, and I'm steward of my land, and that is a job like, you know, that where I can get pride and I get paid for it. And so therefore, that's why I think it's not an issue of appropriate, but I think it's really effective. And therefore, it's important also to tell investors what they're getting into. So, right, it's a project that will invest in people. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, NCS are people getting a different relationship with land. So on that, I think we're also going to have to do a lot of good work, better work with investors so that they understand better how to become good investors in these very special projects.
Very good. Could I jump in with my view on this? So I mean, I agree that there's a role for many different types of finance, and there's a role for blended finance, and there's a role for philanthropy. But I think there is also a role for, you know, pure play capital with commercial returns, and it's just about investors looking for the right opportunities in this space. And, you know, the reason that I believe it is, you know, Lingmin, you asked a question around where are some of the challenges. And one of the challenges is really around scale and sustainability of change and intervention. And, you know, carbon, is particularly in spaces like agriculture, is incredibly distributed, right? It's held by many fragmented smallholder landowners. So, you know, again, using rice as an example, if I want 100 megatons of impact in this space and it's 5 tons a hectare, I need 20 million farmers, 20 million hectares, right, on board of this platform. So how can I create something like that can reach that degree of scale? there has to be some sort of sustainable commercial return. I have to build, real unit economics. There has to be a sound business model that underpins that. And I think if we can find those type of opportunities that really directly link carbon outcomes with real unit economic based businesses, then we have a potential to attract and deploy finance in a very traditional way, in a way that, particularly in the VC space, VCs know how to grow and scale companies. We just have to show them this opportunity to deploy finance in that way.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting. I like this question. It's an interesting one. So if I think back, 15, 16, 17 years, in developing investment strategies and products for New Forest, some of our institutional clients, 15 years ago, they said, look, this kind of carbon thing, look, just deliver us some timber returns, and if there's some upside from carbon, that's great. But fast forward, 15 years, in some ways they can't ignore carbon pricing anymore in certain jurisdictions. It actually becomes part of the underwriting. So particularly where you have regulated markets. So in Australia, we have Australian carbon credit units, which are creating value for plantation forestry methodologies, soil carbon, and so the land use starts to float between agriculture, forestry, maybe carbon-related land management activities. And so that's also happening in New Zealand, and in the US, we manage forests to optimize for timber and carbon income. So I actually turn the question on its head and say, actually, once you get carbon pricing into the landscape, it actually becomes a feature of investment. So if you're a commercial investor in landscapes, particularly in agriculture and forestry, you have to be thinking about it, and it actually starts to deliver optionality for you and how you're managing your investment strategy. The question becomes then, in investment strategies where you are completely and wholly dependent on the carbon finance, what's your risk return, appetite? And so for some investors, right, they'll say, okay, well, I want carbon exposure, but I want to underpin it by, commercial timber production or maybe some agricultural production, and the carbon is on the side. So moving into kind of a purely kind of carbon exposed investment strategy, it's like anything else. It becomes sort of a risk return question. And so where grants, concessionary capital, blended finance becomes very helpful is to do the things where, I don't know, you've got regulatory risk because you don't know how a certain country is going to treat carbon income, or we want to do mangrove restoration and we don't totally understand the operational risk associated with it, or we need long-term carbon offtake to help de-risk the first 10 years of the project. So I think it becomes a risk-return question, like we have in any kind of investment, but certainly blended finance, concessional equity, impact capital at scale is absolutely needed to crowd in more private sector capital where we have more nascent markets and the voluntary markets.
Absolutely, and I think the importance of having sufficient levers and toggles within the variable revenue streams, be it from underlying timber sales, from other farmer activities, as well as in addition to carbon, becomes that very interesting kind of mix. And on that note, I would like to sort of think about the future a little bit, a blue sky thinking. I know we've talked about the carbon markets for the last 15, 20 years. And what more can we do to really effect systems level change, right? And really we talk a lot around quality. What more can we do to better promote better quality outcomes? Radha? This is a big question.
I feel humbled by this question. And
it will come to Maria and Giulia shortly.
And not sure I know how to answer it. Look, I think we've touched on some of these themes already, but carbon finance and related new environmental markets, whether it's nature credits, have a very important role to play. And I think we're already seeing the immediate impacts where people have large working landscapes in forestry and agriculture. And like I just said, the land managers are rational. They'll start to think about how to integrate carbon financing to create high quality outcomes. But I do think we need a mix of, government finance to help farmers not to, to deforest. I also think we need a lot more supply chain intervention from global agribusiness to be really inputting regenerative agricultural transformations and forest protection. I think that we need all three of those interventions, I think, to get high quality nature-based solutions. That's my very short
Thank you. Giulia?
response.
So I think for me, my goal is to make sure that we give the license to operate for businesses to actually use carbon credits and support businesses that do it well, because without the demand, in the end, we can do a lot of great projects, but we need to have increase really the demand. And therefore, we need everybody in this room, but beyond, to make sure that the businesses we know are aware that this is an important tool that they should be using, when is the right time to use it, and if they get attacked, to support them, because there are a lot of businesses now that are shying away, and which is a real pity.
And Marie, final thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. First of all, I think I completely agree with everything that Radha and Giulia have said. So I think the only additional kind of lens or perspective I would add to that is, one of the things that we found is that you can build great businesses that do important work in regenerative agriculture, in helping to restore degraded land, that are not centered purely on carbon credits. So if we can build business models that create genuine value for customers, that create genuine value for the owners of that land, then the carbon credit mechanisms will follow, and that can be an additional revenue stream, but it doesn't always have to be the core revenue stream. And maybe that's the perspective that may enable some private finance. I'm sitting here in the capacity as a VC to sort of say, this is an opportunity that's really worth investing in.
Right. With that, thank you very much, Giulia, Marie, Radha, for the very thoughtful conversation around really wrapping innovative business models alongside managing natural landscapes. So we hope we'll see more getting done in the space. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thanks.